as we've been covering here on any number of levels, obviously the nation in crisis in terms of economics, in terms of the pandemic, in terms of social unrest. Now we have the president and the first lady testing positive for coronavirus. And as part of the impact of whatever is going on in our society, we can see some of the symptoms of just this kind of rot at the core of our nation. And this is the latest evidence of this. This was written up in Politico, but it's research that shows the number of Americans who believe that violence is justified if the other side wins the election has risen. And not only that, Saagar, and let me pull up these numbers. So if not only have those numbers risen, but also for the number of Americans who believe violence is justified in service of winning, advancing their political goals. So on that front, as recently as 2018, the numbers were pretty low. Democrats 13% and Republicans 11% said that violence is justified in advancing political goals. Still not great, but relatively low levels. Those numbers have shot all the way up to 33% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans saying violence is at least somewhat justified in advancing political goals. The numbers are even more dire when you look at their sense of whether violence is justified if their opponent wins the presidential election. So 44% of Republicans and 41% of Democrats said it would be at least a little justification for violence if the other party's nominee wins the election. And this, of course, and these numbers also are up even from June. So tensions continue to rise. And this, of course, as we look at a very fraught political landscape, a very unusual political cycle where we may not know results immediately. The apparent winner on election night may change as mail-in ballots come in. We're learning more and more about the complications with those ballots and the procedures that voters have to follow to make sure that their vote counts. Another really troubling set of numbers here.
Yeah, it's really bad. And one of the things that they say, it's always very important to understand with statistics, is about what it means for the extremes. And so they say here, this means that the ideological extremes of each party are 2 to 4 times more apt to see violence as justified than their party's mainstream members. So remember that, which is that when you have the ideological extremes of both parties, both very comfortable and likely in certain cases to believe in using violence. That's what it means when you see that 33% figure, that they're both right on those polar opposites. It can lead to a real problem.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you see that the Republican number there has shot up significantly, even from June, to 36%. With Democrats, it's at 33%. In June 2020, it was tied at 30% each. So you can see that there is reaction amongst the right to a lot of the news that's going on. Left is the same thing about what's happening. This is bad. Like, this really is a sign of a deep undercurrent of rot in our culture. You can see this in the murder rate. I mean, you're going and you're looking at, like, I bring this up a lot because it's crazy, is that people are killing each other over nothing. Is that they go and they read, you go and you read about what's happening. Part of it, I think, is law enforcement, although I know it's controversial. But you go and you look at the circumstances which are leading to murders. It's like people at gas stations getting into arguments over a scratch on somebody's car. Newlywed guy, his wife is begging him, don't do anything, pulls out a gun and shoots the guy dead. And this is happening. These are average, small altercations, which generally would have escalated to the level of like fist fight and now going to death. And it's happening all over the country. People are just so on edge, I think, with the lockdown, with the crisis, with what's happening. And I mean, just like the level of aggregate stress in Americans' lives, depression, drug use, everything, it's all correlated with an increase in the murder rate. And we're talking like 35, 40% in some major cities. So it doesn't surprise me, but it's not good.
Every red light in this nation is flashing right now. I mean, there's just no other way to look at it. And look, we've also seen gun sales spike up like crazy, record-breaking numbers across the country. Not a great sign either. And look, in part, obviously, it's a complex stew of the reason why we are in this incredibly tense place. But I really do, in part, blame the media because basically they've turned us against each other. They have made money destroying this country and setting us one against the other and convincing the nation that your greatest enemy and the greatest threat to you and your family and your livelihood is basically your next door neighbor who might have a different ideology from you. I mean, that really, and I bring this up all the time, this is Matt Taibbi's thesis in his book, which I keep recommending here, Hate Inc., but I think it is so profound and so insightful. You have these cable news networks that need to gin up ratings 24 hours a day. They used to have, the news business used to have like the Cold War as the enemy. Then they had the Islamic terrorism to paint as like that's the existential threat. And then they said, okay, it's not that anymore. Now it's you. Now it's your brother or your sister or your neighbor or your friend who has a different ideology for you. They're coming for your family. They're going to destroy the country. They're coming to indoctrinate your kids. And that over time, I think has so fed the just absolute destructive existential politics in this country that is literally tearing us apart.
It's
right now.
interesting. I was talking to Brett Weinstein on my podcast about this, and he was like, look, the ultimate indicator to me is gun sales. Because he's like, that means people think that there is a realistic need that they might have to shoot somebody else within the next 6 months. And I was like, oh, when you put it that way, you can see, like, if you have record high gun sales, there's a reason for that, right? Like, people feel inherently so at risk, they're willing to spend considerable amounts of money for the average American. I mean, you can't get a decent gun in this country for like less than $500. And you're saying I may have a realistic need in my life to shoot another person. That's kind of the ultimate indicator of whether things are going okay or not. And you drive past any gun store in this country right now, line out the door.
Yeah. The one thing I want to say is, look, just because people say that violence may be justified, there's a big difference between that and actually committing violence, like taking that step. But again, the fact that we see this increase in the numbers is, it's scary. It's deeply troubling.
It certainly is.
All right, we'll have more Rising for you after this.